This became the turning point of the entire expedition. The moment Ghislain stopped fighting like a commander and gambled himself entirely. After Belinda was badly injured protecting him, Gillian argued that fighting the blood python's head alone was impossible. The eyes had already failed as a weak point, and retreat seemed like the only rational choice left. Ghislain ignored that and ordered everyone else to focus on widening the wounds on the body and tail while he stayed in front alone. The blood python accepted the challenge. Now completely fixated on Ghislain, it stopped caring about the others and relentlessly attacked him. Ghislain didn't strike back. He only dodged again and again, waiting for something. His mana was nearly depleted, but his experience carried him. He deliberately frustrated the monster until instinct overtook caution. Then he did something nobody expected. When the blood python lunged with its mouth wide open, Ghislain jumped directly inside. Everyone watching thought he had gone insane, but Ghislain's reasoning was simple. If the outside was impossible to break, destroy it from the inside. Inside the mouth, the soft flesh wasn't protected like the scales. The problem was that the creature's venom was overwhelming. Poison filled the air and immediately began burning through his clothes and body. Ghislain activated his second and third mana cores and jammed his sword into the roof of the blood python's mouth before it could swallow him. The monster exploded into panic. Outside, Gillian realized what Ghislain was trying to do and immediately attacked the head to keep pressure on it. While the blood python thrashed and smashed itself against the ground trying to kill the thing inside its mouth, Ghislain anchored himself deeper and unleashed everything. All three mana cores, at full output. Mana erupted directly inside the blood python's skull. The fight stopped being skill versus skill. It became endurance versus endurance. The blood python flooded its mouth with venom to dissolve Ghislain. Ghislain burned through his own body to keep outputting mana. His muscles tore, his bones cracked. Venom seeped into him. His body began breaking faster than it could endure. But he refused to stop. He had already decided if this failed, the expedition failed, and if the expedition failed, everything he came to change would collapse. Eventually, the blood python started weakening. Its movements slowed. It stopped slamming itself into the ground. Realizing this was the last chance, Ghislain abandoned the sword lodged inside and threw himself out of its mouth. He landed barely conscious. Even touching him burned people because the venom and overloaded mana were still reacting across his body. But Ghislain kept watching. The blood python was still alive. The mercenaries immediately formed around him. Nobody ran, nobody hesitated. They protected him. When the blood python collapsed and could no longer move properly, Kyor ordered everyone to avoid the venom and tear apart the wounded sections. The mercenaries charged. They hacked, stabbed, ripped. The monster that had looked completely invincible was reduced piece by piece, and while lying on the ground half destroyed himself, Ghislain quietly said, "Thank goodness, it's finally over." The blood python stared at him until the end. Then its eyes slowly closed. The strongest monster they had faced so far, the one that should never have appeared there, finally died. After killing the blood python, the mercenaries didn't stop attacking immediately. Fear had completely taken over, and they kept striking the corpse until Gillian shouted several times for them to stop. Only after waiting and confirming the monster truly wouldn't move again did the reality sink in. They had won. The impossible enemy that had pushed them to despair was dead. When they rushed toward Ghislain, they found him barely conscious. Even then, instead of praising himself, he weakly told them they had all done well. That single line completely broke the remaining tension, and the mercenaries erupted in celebration. For them, Ghislain wasn't just an employer anymore. They started jokingly calling themselves the Ghislain Mercenary Corps, but behind the joke was genuine loyalty. They had watched him stand at the front, nearly die multiple times, and finally throw himself into a monster's mouth to finish the battle. Then, Ghislain collapsed. When he woke later, he immediately asked about Belinda and the casualties instead of asking about himself. Belinda survived, though heavily injured. More than half the mercenaries had died. Gislin himself was in terrible condition. His body was wrapped in bandages, poison still remained inside him, and overloading all three cores had severely damaged his muscles and bones. Jillian scolded him, frustrated that he would throw away his life like that. Kayor also admitted he had never seen someone fight in such a ridiculous way. Still, despite everything, Gislin treated it lightly and moved on. After resting another day, something unexpected happened. No monsters appeared. Trusting Gislin again, everyone recovered and continued moving. Eventually, they reached the destination, and everyone froze. The area ahead was filled with countless blue glowing crystal fragments embedded into the rocks. Runestones. The entire place shined faintly as if the forest itself contained stars. Runestones were one of the most valuable magical resources in existence, used for magical tools and barriers, extremely rare and worth enormous amounts. Nobody could believe what they were seeing. Suddenly everything made sense. The dangerous route, the preparation, the insistence on continuing. Gislin hadn't entered the forest blindly. He knew this place existed. Even Gislin himself was surprised because the amount was far greater than what he remembered. The mercenaries finally understood. This expedition wasn't madness, it was success. Then Gislin thanked everyone. He acknowledged that they only reached this place because people had risked their lives and endured together. And then he announced something unexpected. Triple payment for everyone, and compensation for the families of everyone who died. The mercenaries exploded in celebration. In their world, dead mercenaries were usually forgotten once paid. But Gislin treated their lives as something valuable. Jillian quietly realized something too. Gislin wasn't stingy. He simply never wasted money. When something mattered, he spent without hesitation. Belinda eventually woke up as well. Even while badly injured, she complained about Gislin diving into a monster's mouth and acting recklessly again. Gislin thanked her sincerely and told her to rest. Even half asleep, she muttered instructions about not eating plain jerky and making proper soup. After reassuring her, Gislin looked at the mountain of runestones. After all the blood, deaths, and suffering, he smiled and said they could finally start making money. After discovering the runestone field, the entire atmosphere changed from survival to reward. The mercenaries became excited and immediately started extracting the crystals. Since the detailed refinement would happen later at the estate, their job was simply to break the rocks apart and load them into carts. Naturally, some of them started thinking like mercenaries again. A few quietly suggested pocketing small fragments, since even tiny runestones were worth a fortune. To them, taking a little extra during work was practically tradition. Then Gordon loudly announced to everyone that he wasn't taking anything because triple pay was already enough. Everyone thought he had suddenly become noble, until moments later when he casually pulled hidden runestone fragments out of his pants and threw them away. That instantly exposed him. Gislin quietly pointed out to Jillian that people who loudly claim they don't care about money are often the ones you watch most carefully. Jillian immediately warned everyone that stealing even a single fragment would be treated as contract violation and punishable by death. That ended the discussion. Even disappointed, nobody argued. At this point, they respected Gislin and feared Jillian enough to behave. As the carts filled, Gislin unexpectedly ordered several carts to remain empty. The mercenaries were confused because runestones were worth enormous money. But Gislin explained that they weren't taking only runestones. They were taking the blood python. His reasoning surprised everyone. The corpse itself was a treasure. Its scent and blood would scare monsters away from roads for months. Its hide and scales could become armor. Its venom could coat weapons. And transporting part of it now would help protect future expeditions when they returned for the remaining runestones. Only then did everyone realize Gislin wasn't thinking about immediate profit. He was already planning infrastructure and future expansion. So they spent hours carving apart the giant corpse and loading whatever they could carry. By evening, the carts were overflowing with runestones, blood python remains, and materials gathered throughout the expedition. That night was their first truly peaceful sleep. No monsters appeared. The corpse of the blood python itself became protection. The next day they started returning. Without horses, the mercenaries had to drag the heavily loaded carts themselves. It was exhausting, but the return was far easier because the road had already been cleared and monsters stayed away. Eventually, they approached the forest's edge. That's when a group appeared, soldiers and knights from the estate. At first, it seemed like a rescue party, but Ghislain immediately noticed something was wrong. The leading knight announced they were there to arrest him under the Lord's orders for entering the Forest of Beasts without permission. Ghislain stayed calm, but the knight pushed further. Instead of respectfully carrying out orders, he openly mocked Ghislain and threatened him, clearly hoping to provoke resistance so he could beat and humiliate him. Then something unexpected happened. Before Ghislain reacted all, the mercenaries drew their weapons. At once, they surrounded the soldiers. The knight was shocked. These were mercenaries. He expected them to back away immediately. Instead, they stood in front of Ghislain. Some even joked that this was still the Forest of Beasts and nobody would ever find the bodies. The threat wasn't empty. These men had survived monsters, darkness, and death together. Compared to that, soldiers from the estate no longer seemed intimidating. The knight finally realized something terrifying. These mercenaries weren't protecting Ghislain because of money anymore. They were doing it because they wanted to. And suddenly understanding that nobody there would save him, the arrogant knight immediately dropped to his knees and begged, "Young lord, please spare me." Gillian's axe stopped just short of cutting through the knight's neck. The atmosphere completely changed. The knight remained frozen on his knees, staring at the blood dripping onto the ground beneath him. For the first time, he realized the mercenaries weren't bluffing. If Ghislain had not spoken, nobody there would have hesitated to kill him and throw the bodies into the Forest of Beasts without leaving evidence. The soldiers behind him also turned pale and quietly lowered their weapons. None of them had expected the mercenaries to protect Ghislain this fiercely. They had come expecting to drag back the reckless young lord who had disobeyed orders, not stand surrounded by hardened survivors who looked more dangerous than monsters. Ghislain slowly approached and casually helped the knight back to his feet as though nothing had happened. Smiling lightly, he explained that everyone had simply been exhausted after a difficult journey and emotions were running high. He accepted the arrest order without resistance, joking that he disliked being tied up anyway, but quietly instructed the knight to arrange treatment for Belinda and prepare lodging for the mercenaries. The knight immediately agreed without argument. The difference from before was obvious. He no longer looked at Ghislain with contempt, but with fear and caution. As they left the forest, people gathered in large numbers outside the entrance. Villagers, workers, and soldiers whispered among themselves as they saw the returning expedition. The group looked miserable. Less than half the mercenaries remained alive. Most were injured, their armor was broken, and the carts behind them were loaded with strange cargo covered under cloth. Many assumed Ghislain had failed and would now face punishment for disobeying the Lord's orders. Along the way, Ghislain casually asked about Scoven and learned that the knight had already been imprisoned for submitting false reports to buy time for the expedition. Ghislain simply nodded and continued walking. When they arrived at the estate and entered the great hall, the retainers had already gathered, and their anger exploded immediately. Zwalter glared at Ghislain and reminded him that he had explicitly forbidden entering the Forest of Beasts. The retainers piled on, accusing him of recklessness, of risking the estate, and of manipulating soldiers into covering for him. However, their true anger soon shifted to another issue entirely. They revealed that Raypold Estate had withdrawn all support and broken the engagement after hearing that Ghislain had taken 20,000 gold from Amelia under the excuse of supporting Ferdium. The retainers explained that the estate was already struggling financially, and losing Raypold's aid could collapse everything. They demanded to know where the money had gone. Ghislain calmly admitted that most of the money had already been spent. Hearing that answer caused complete outrage. Homern nearly exploded and accused him of destroying the estate. Albert desperately tried calculating whether enough remained to salvage their finances, only for Ghislain to casually explain that almost everything had been used on mercenaries, laborers, supplies, scrolls, food, and preparations. To the retainers, it sounded like confirmation that he had burned 20,000 gold for nothing. Randolph completely lost his temper and tried charging at him before being restrained. Even Albert, normally composed, looked devastated. They began talking about imprisonment, punishment, and immediately sending Ghislaine to apologize to Raypold. Through all of this, Ghislaine stayed strangely relaxed. Then he called for Jillian. A massive chest was carried into the hall and dropped heavily onto the floor. Nobody understood. Ghislaine walked over, rested his hand on the chest, and said calmly that this was what real investment looked like. When he opened it, blue light poured into the hall. Silence swallowed the room. The retainers stared blankly at the glowing crystals inside. Albert approached first and picked one up with trembling fingers. The moment he examined it, his expression collapsed. Runestone. Real runestone. The hall instantly erupted into chaos. Everyone rushed forward to confirm with their own eyes. Blue crystals filled the chest, each containing natural magical energy. The retainers who had been screaming moments earlier suddenly forgot their anger. Zwalter slowly stood and asked where it had come from. Ghislaine answered simply, "It came from the Forest of Beasts." Nobody could speak after that. The value inside that single chest was already impossible to compare to 20,000 gold. Then Ghislaine pointed outside and calmly explained that there was more. Multiple carts had returned carrying additional runestones, along with rare materials and even part of a blood python corpse. Only then did everyone finally understand. The expedition they called Madness had not been a reckless gamble. Ghislaine had spent money to create a road, secure resources, and bring back something capable of changing the estate's future entirely. The retainers stared at him speechlessly, while Ghislaine smiled and said that what they called wasteful spending was simply investment. The anger and outrage that had been directed at him moments earlier abruptly froze. Randolph, who had been charging at Ghislaine while screaming about investment and calling him useless, stopped instantly when the blue glow spilled out from the open chest. The retainers gathered around in disbelief while Zwalter struggled to even ask what he was seeing, despite already suspecting the answer. Ghislaine calmly explained that the contents were runestones collected from the Forest of Beasts, and that what they were seeing was only a fraction of what remained there. He further revealed that the expedition had not been random exploration, but a targeted breakthrough toward resource-rich territory, and that he intended to later construct roads and fortifications to secure continuous extraction. This revelation completely overturned everyone's assumptions because the expedition they mocked as reckless madness had instead become the greatest discovery in Ferdium's history. The retainers reacted with disbelief first, and then rapidly shifted into excitement and greed. Homern initially refused to accept reality and accused Ghislaine of either stealing the runestones or buying them using the 20,000 gold from Raypold estate. Ghislaine casually dismissed the accusation and pointed out that there were entire carts loaded with runestones waiting outside. Albert immediately realized the implications. The estate would no longer collapse even if Raypold's support disappeared. The retainers crowded around the chest, touching the runestones repeatedly while trying to comprehend their value. Meanwhile, Ghislaine internally reflected that he had narrowly succeeded. If Amelia had acted slightly faster, he would never have entered the forest, would never have found the runestones, and all initiative would have been lost. He recognized that Amelia's move wasn't just revenge, but an attempt to limit his future actions, and understood that stronger enemies like the Delphine side would eventually target Ferdium once the runestone mine became known. After letting everyone absorb the shock, Ghislaine abruptly shut the chest and reminded them of their previous discussion about sending him to Raypold in chains. Nobody could answer anymore. The same people who had treated him as incompetent now had to face the reality that Ghislaine had succeeded where generations of Ferdium lords had failed. But not everyone abandoned politics. While others remained stunned, Homern quietly signaled a knight because he intended to use Ghislaine's achievement as leverage and secure ownership over the runestones for the estate. Ghislaine had already anticipated this. The doors opened and revealed armed mercenaries waiting outside and pressuring the estate soldiers. The retainers were shocked and accused Ghislaine of rebellion, but Ghislaine casually denied it and explained that they were only there to protect him. In reality, he knew that even loyal retainers could move against him if they believed it benefited the estate. So he intentionally demonstrated force to make clear he wouldn't surrender what he earned. Zwalter's reaction was different from the others. Instead of becoming angry, he became interested. More than the runestones themselves, he was surprised by how Ghislain had changed. The son he remembered as weak and troublesome had anticipated political moves, gathered loyal followers, secured overwhelming results, and returned stronger. Despite protests from Homern and Randolph, Zwalter chose to let the incident pass. He admitted internally that it was better for Ghislain to act boldly than remain useless, and decided that since Ghislain was the future heir, forcing him too hard now would be a mistake. He warned Ghislain not to disobey again but effectively acknowledged his success. Once things calmed down, Albert switched strategies. Since force wouldn't work, he tried negotiation. He argued that the original 20,000 gold belonged to the estate and that without that money the expedition would never have happened, so the estate deserved a share of the profits. The retainers quickly agreed and tried to claim around 30 to 40%. Ghislain listened calmly, pretended to consider the logic, and then casually rejected the entire premise. Instead of sharing ownership, he simply offered to return the original 20,000 gold with interest, instantly shutting down their attempt to claim rights over the runestones while making it difficult for them to argue further. Their real concern wasn't recovering the money, but maintaining a stable source of income after losing support from Raypold Estate. However, since Ghislain now controlled the runestones, the balance of power had shifted. The Forest of Beasts technically wasn't direct estate land, and no one had legal grounds to seize the discovery unless they were willing to openly use force. Realizing they had little leverage left, the vassals fell silent. Seeing their hesitation, Ghislain deliberately softened his tone and said that as the young lord, he couldn't ignore the estate's hardship and that he originally retrieved the runestones for Ferdium's sake. The room relaxed immediately because everyone feared he would claim everything for himself. However, Ghislain attached conditions. First, he demanded Scoben's release, arguing that Scoben only falsified reports because Ghislain forced him into the situation. Since punishing Scoben no longer benefited anyone, and compared to the estate's future, it was a minor issue. Nobody strongly opposed it. Second, Ghislain officially demanded permission to proceed with building a garrison inside the Forest of Beasts to support workers and soldiers. Third, he declared that the forest would remain restricted to prevent reckless exploration and unnecessary deaths. Although the retainers secretly hated this because it meant Ghislain effectively monopolized access to the runestones, nobody openly challenged him. Then Ghislain revealed his real objective. He demanded authority to independently recruit, manage, and replenish mercenaries and security forces without interference from the estate. The retainers immediately understood what this meant. Ghislain wasn't simply asking for money, he was creating an independent military structure inside Ferdium. They were alarmed because a troublesome heir with wealth and private forces could become uncontrollable. One vassal attempted to object, but Ghislain immediately suggested canceling everything and leaving, making it clear he wasn't negotiating from weakness. Nobody dared continue opposing him. He lightly joked that he was sensitive and almost walked out, but the threat underneath was obvious. With mercenaries already backing him and runestones in his possession, the retainers had no real choice. Finally, Ghislain handed the decision to Zwalter. Zwalter carefully considered the situation. He recognized that Ghislain had achieved something extraordinary, even if luck had played a role. For years, nobody had dared develop the Forest of Beasts, yet Ghislain entered, survived, discovered runestones, returned with loyal followers, and transformed the estate's future. Zwalter worried that granting too much freedom could become dangerous, but suppressing Ghislain now might destroy the momentum and potential he had finally shown. He also noticed something unexpected. Ghislain had changed completely. The son who once seemed weak and troublesome now acted decisively, prepared politically, and even brought force as insurance. Eventually, Zwalter chose trust over control. Zwalter accepted all of Ghislain's conditions and granted him authority while giving one final warning. If Ghislain ever harmed the estate or interfered with the defense of the North, he would strip away everything and imprison him. Ghislain accepted immediately and reassured him that the estate would not suffer. He even hinted that he had plans for the remaining wealth and would later invest it into Ferdium itself. Zwalter didn't ask further questions, but quietly felt pride toward his son for the first time in a long while. The most awkward people afterward were the retainers who had opposed Ghislain the hardest. Homern regretted not supporting the forest expedition from the beginning because now he had lost all opportunity to benefit. Realizing resistance was pointless, he instantly changed his attitude and began praising Ghislain's talent and success. Albert followed by acting friendly and proposing future financial cooperation. Even Randolph awkwardly complimented Ghislain's boldness and started talking about military strength. Ghislain watched all three abruptly switch sides and politely accepted, while making it clear that from now on, he would remember who stood where. Their pride disappeared instantly once profit and influence entered the picture. As the meeting ended, Ghislain reassured his father that he would take responsibility for the estate so Zwalter could continue focusing on defending the North. Zwalter treated it as youthful confidence and didn't fully believe him yet. But Ghislain's thoughts were already elsewhere. The runestones, the authority, the mercenaries, and the forest were never his final goal. In his mind, this entire operation had only been preparation. The estate's development mattered, but something more urgent was coming: war. After securing authority from Zwalter and effectively winning the political battle inside the estate, Ghislain immediately moved to clean up unfinished business instead of celebrating. One of the first people he visited was Skoven, the knight imprisoned for filing a false report that allowed Ghislain time to enter the Forest of Beasts. Inside the prison, Skoven sat regretting everything. Rationally, he knew trusting the young lord had been insane. No one entered the Forest of Beasts and came back alive. Yet Ghislain had spoken with such confidence that Skoven had believed him anyway, and ended up imprisoned. His lieutenant, Ricardo, who got dragged into punishment simply for being associated with him, complained less about prison and more about the possibility of future forced labor. The two joked bitterly about returning to ordinary life, though Skoven admitted he had nowhere else to go since Ferdinand itself was his hometown. Their conversation drifted into the unfairness of life, as Skoven envied Ricardo's effortless popularity and appearance, while he himself had worked endlessly just to become a mediocre knight. Then everything changed when Ghislain suddenly appeared at the prison entrance alive and smiling as if nothing had happened. Both men were stunned. Not only had the young lord survived the Forest of Beasts, but he had personally come to see them. Ghislain casually joked with them, called Skoven a liar, and teased Ricardo's appearance. But his reason for coming was serious. When the guard hesitated to open the cell due to lack of official orders, Ghislain simply stepped aside and Gillian destroyed the lock outright. Ghislain informed them they had been pardoned and restored. Then unexpectedly, he handed each of them a pouch full of gold. His reasoning was simple. They helped him succeed, so they deserved compensation. Unlike traditional nobles who relied purely on hierarchy and loyalty, Ghislain rewarded results. To him, loyalty followed proper treatment and tangible rewards. Skoven and Ricardo were overwhelmed. They had expected disgrace and punishment, but instead received freedom, recognition, and wealth. As Ghislain left, Skoven felt genuine respect, while Ricardo immediately started planning a celebration with the women who already supported him, once again making Skoven painfully aware of how unfair life could be. After resolving that matter, Ghislain went directly to visit Belinda, who was still bedridden after nearly sacrificing herself against the blood python. Although she looked slightly healthier, her body remained damaged, not just from impact but from severe mana backlash, after drawing more power than she could safely handle. Even while injured, Belinda worried more about Ghislain's punishment than herself, and immediately asked what happened with the Lord. Ghislain downplayed everything and hid the fact that he had effectively intimidated the estate leadership with mercenary support. But instead of simply talking, he did something unexpected. He grabbed Belinda's hand and began directly channeling his own mana into her body. Belinda immediately panicked because foreign mana entering another person's body was dangerous and could cause catastrophic rejection. But Ghislain calmly suppressed her chaotic mana flow and carefully stabilized her damaged internal circulation. Sweat poured down his body while Gillian stood guard, understanding how dangerous the process was. Eventually, a faint red mist rose as Ghislain finished stabilizing her condition. Belinda immediately felt the difference. Her mana, which had been spiraling out of control, had become calm. What shocked her even more was Ghislaine's absurdly precise mana control. She realized this level of manipulation should be impossible for someone his age. That realization led her to ask directly whether Ghislaine was truly using the Ferdium family's mana technique. The red aura he emitted felt completely different, more refined, sharper, and filled with killing intent. Ghislaine awkwardly admitted that he had modified the family technique himself to suit his body. Belinda immediately dismissed it as nonsense because altering a mana method was considered nearly impossible. Such techniques were refined over generations and treated as priceless family secrets. But Ghislaine insisted he was telling the truth and casually promised that one day he would teach and improve her own method too. Belinda tried to brush it off and change the topic, assuming now that they had wealth they could finally relax for a while. But Ghislaine immediately rejected the idea. He told her they would rest briefly and move again soon. Confused, she asked whether they were leaving to sell runestones. Ghislaine admitted that was part of it, but not the real reason. There were more preparations to make and no time to waste. Belinda finally pressed him directly and asked what he was really trying to accomplish after all this rushing, risk, and madness. Ghislaine smiled faintly and gave an answer that completely changed the mood. Their estate wasn't safe. After securing the runestone and stabilizing the situation inside the estate, Ghislaine finally revealed the reason behind his relentless pace. When he said Ferdium was in danger, Belinda couldn't understand at all. From her perspective, the estate's greatest weakness, money, had just been solved. With the runestone deposit, they could rebuild roads, strengthen infrastructure, and finally stop struggling for survival. If anyone was dangerous to the estate now, she thought, it was probably Ghislaine himself with how recklessly he acted. So hearing him say disaster was approaching sounded absurd. Realizing they would never continue following him blindly forever, Ghislaine dismissed everyone from the room except Belinda and Jillian. Until now, they had trusted him without fully understanding him. But he decided they deserved an explanation. Just not the truth about returning from the future. Instead, he revealed something only he and Elena knew. Someone had already been targeting Ferdium for a long time. He explained Elena's assassination attempt, the appearance of the Dig-Out Prince, and how they secretly disposed of both Frank and the prince's body to avoid triggering a territorial conflict. As the explanation continued, Belinda and Jillian finally started connecting all the strange events. Ghislaine hadn't been rushing because he was impatient. He had been racing against an unseen threat. Jillian struggled to understand. Ferdium was poor, underdeveloped, constantly threatened by barbarians, and militarily weak. Why would anyone even want this territory? Ghislaine then pointed out the obvious thing they were missing. That was true before. Now they had runestones. At that moment, Jillian understood. A weak estate with enormous wealth wasn't a blessing. It was bait. Belinda immediately guessed the conclusion: war. But even then, she tried to reject the idea. Nobody knew about the runestones yet. Ghislaine agreed, but only partly. He believed the enemy wasn't originally targeting Ferdium because of the runestones. There was another reason. However, discovering the deposit had accelerated everything. Once word spread, whatever hidden enemies existed would move much sooner. Jillian asked if they should tell Walter and prepare openly. Ghislaine refused. They still didn't know who could be trusted. Even Elena's protectors had betrayed them before. If spies existed inside the estate, revealing everything now would only speed up disaster. Their priority had to be moving first. Selling runestones, building strength, preparing quietly. Belinda listened quietly before giving her usual straightforward answer. If war was coming, she would help. To her, war was simple. Kill the enemy commander, and the rest follows. Ghislaine laughed because in a way she wasn't wrong, but this problem needed more than assassinations. Then Belinda noticed something strange. Why was Ghislaine moving normally? Only days ago, his body had been destroyed. Fractured bones, torn muscles, poison damage, total mana exhaustion. Yet now he could walk naturally and even manipulate mana with incredible precision. She suspected it was related to his strange red mana technique. Ghislaine checked himself seriously for the first time. She was right. This recovery made no sense. His technique wasn't designed for healing. By all logic, he should still be bedridden for weeks. But the poison was gone. The pain was mostly gone. His muscles had nearly recovered. Even he couldn't explain it. For the first time in a while, something genuinely surprised him. He decided to rest and inspect himself later. Belinda didn't fully believe him, but let it go. Before he left, she asked one final question. If war could come in only a few months, and proper soldiers needed at least 6 months to a year of training, wasn't it already too late? Ghislaine stopped and smiled. There was already a force that could fight immediately. Belinda guessed mercenaries. Ghislaine shook his head. Mercenaries would help, but there was another force, one nobody else could use. After hearing Ghislaine talk about preparing a force that could be deployed immediately, Belinda and Jillian were left with complicated expressions. At this point, neither of them could confidently say whether his ideas were genius or madness anymore. Everything Ghislaine had done recently had completely broken common sense, but there was one important difference this time. He had actually explained himself. Until now, they had simply followed without understanding. This time he had shared his reasoning, his fears, and even his expectations of war. Even if they couldn't fully accept it, they decided to trust him again. Belinda gave up trying to argue and simply accepted that Ghislaine already had some bizarre plan in mind. Jillian reached the same conclusion. After seeing Ghislaine cure Rachel, survive impossible situations, discover runestones, and somehow predict danger before anyone else, Jillian had started believing that there were things only Ghislaine understood. Ghislaine urged Belinda to recover and told Jillian to finally visit Rachel while there was time because things would soon become far busier. Once both left, the room became quiet, but Ghislaine couldn't rest. Instead of enjoying the victory, he started calculating. The runestone discovery had already exploded among the retainers. By tomorrow, rumors would spread through the estate. Within days, everyone would know. And if everyone knew, then Amelia would know. And the Duke of Delphine would know. Ghislaine sat alone thinking through possibilities. Amelia wasn't the same type of enemy as Delphine. Delphine wanted territory. Amelia wanted him personally. That made her far more troublesome because her actions were harder to predict. He estimated the timing. 1 week at fastest, 2 weeks at most. Once the news spread, preparations against Ferdium would begin. Even if nobody declared war immediately, they would need excuses, negotiations, troop gathering, logistics. Wealthy territories could prepare for war frighteningly fast. That meant Ferdium had maybe 2 to 3 months. And ironically, this was also the easiest time to attack. The estate was still weak. The runestones had not yet become power. Money alone did not create soldiers. Ghislaine reached a painful conclusion. Most of the runestones would need to be consumed immediately instead of sold slowly for long-term profit. Then, while thinking about enemies, his attention suddenly shifted to something else. Money. Cain still hadn't paid. Ghislaine immediately became annoyed. He could tolerate many things, but not unpaid debt. His mercenary instincts surfaced instantly. To him, getting cheated out of money was almost unforgivable. The title King of Mercenaries wasn't built on generosity. Someone who withheld payment after agreeing to terms was asking for trouble. Ghislaine decided he would deal with Cain later. Only after exhausting himself mentally did he finally fall asleep. When he woke up, his room looked completely different. Alcohol, meat, animal skins, fine cloth, stacks of gifts. Confused, Ghislaine asked where everything came from. The maids explained. Treasurer, Master of Arms, Chief Overseer, Secretary, Knight Commander. Influential people throughout the estate had come personally while he slept and left gifts. Suddenly, Ghislaine understood. Everything had changed. Before obtaining the runestones, people avoided him. Now they were desperately trying to get close. He found the gifts amusing because compared to his days as King of Mercenaries, they weren't valuable at all. But he could see this effort. People in a poor estate couldn't give more than this. So instead of keeping them, Ghislaine told the maids to distribute everything: wine and meat to mercenaries, cloth and supplies to servants. Keep nothing. The maids were shocked. For them, these gifts represented luxuries they rarely even touched. Watching their excitement, Ghislain casually told them to thank everyone and mentioned he would visit later. After the gifts were handled, Ghislain finally turned his attention to himself and realized something was wrong. His face had recovered. The poison was gone. The soreness remained, but not enough. He sat down and circulated his mana. After slowly observing the three cores, he opened his eyes with genuine confusion. His mana had changed. Originally, his mana had been violent, destructive, and difficult to control. Now something cold and subtle existed inside it, like poison hidden inside a blade. This had never happened before, not even in his previous life. Mana normally didn't change its nature once formed. Different techniques created different mana from the start, but existing mana didn't suddenly mutate, yet his had. He considered the impossible explanation, the blood python's venom. Could the poison have mixed into his mana itself? The thought sounded ridiculous, but nothing else explained his accelerated recovery. He tried controlling the strange energy, but couldn't. It was too faint. Eventually, he stopped. Recovery first, investigation later. Just as he finished organizing his thoughts, someone entered. A loud voice filled the room. Randolph, the knight commander who had recently wanted to snap his spine in half. Now he entered smiling so hard it looked painful, laughing loudly, praising Ghislain's health, calling him the pride of the estate and a true warrior. Ghislain stared at him quietly and realized the people who once wanted to punish him had started lining up at his door instead. Ghislain already knew why he came. Randolph had sent gifts earlier that morning and now personally came to collect something more valuable: money. Randolph approached carefully, pretending concern for the estate's future before slowly steering the conversation toward the knights. His argument actually wasn't unreasonable. Ferdium's knight order was miserable. Low pay, constant war, no rewards, no land. Most capable knights had already left long ago. Only the stubbornly loyal or slightly insane remained. Even recent betrayals made sense to Randolph because honestly, who would willingly stay and suffer here forever? So Randolph tried to push Ghislain emotionally. He didn't ask for official funding, not taxes, not a state budget, just a little development fund. A donation, private money. Ghislain immediately rejected him. He calmly declared he had no money. Randolph nearly exploded. The richest man in the estate claiming poverty sounded insulting. But Ghislain casually explained that every coin was already assigned elsewhere. To Randolph, that only sounded worse. Now he became convinced Ghislain planned to hoard everything for himself. He tried again and again, arguing that military power mattered more than anything. Pay debt later, build knights first, strength solves everything. But Ghislain never moved. Then before Randolph could continue, another hunter arrived. Albert, the treasurer. Unlike Randolph, Albert came with elegant logic. He congratulated Ghislain, praised his intelligence, then immediately switched topics. Debt, the estate's debt. Albert argued that technically the 20,000 gold had originally belonged to the estate, and since Ghislain inherited Ferdium one day, the estate's debt was effectively his debt. Ghislain immediately shut him down. No, my money's my money. Albert's expression almost broke. Like Randolph, he realized Ghislain had become terrifying now that he actually had resources. Albert then argued from necessity. Debt repayment, interest, credit, financial stability. But Ghislain refused again. Every coin already had a purpose. Eventually, both men stopped negotiating with Ghislain entirely and started fighting each other. Randolph screamed that knights mattered more. Albert screamed that debt mattered more. One argued strength solved debt. The other argued unpaid debt destroyed strength. They ended up planning the order of spending money that didn't belong to either of them. Ghislain watched the two grown men argue over his future money and quietly regretted waking up. Just before he decided to throw them out, a night arrived. Zwalter was calling, urgently, only Ghislain. Neither Randolph nor Albert could follow. Both shouted behind him like desperate creditors losing their final opportunity. One demanded night funding, the other demanded debt payment. Gislin escaped immediately. But when he entered Zwalter's office, the atmosphere changed completely. Cold, quiet, heavy, Zwalter stood silently facing the window. Unlike before, there was no anger, no shouting. He calmly asked about Gislin's condition, asked if he recovered, told him to take care of his health. That alone felt strange. Then Zwalter slowly asked how he planned to spend the runestone money. Gislin gave the same answer. Cover the missing Raypold support. Continue his project. Zwalter nodded, then repeated something strange. Whatever you do, I trust you'll use it for the estate. Then he brought up Gislin's childhood, all the trouble, the damage, the mistakes, and quietly said every time the retainers wanted punishment, he forgave him. Because he was his son. Then once again, he repeated it. Whatever you do, I trust you. That was when Gislin finally understood. This wasn't a lecture. This wasn't about punishment. This wasn't even about money. His father, the man who never trusted him before, was awkwardly trying to say, I'm giving you authority. Don't betray that trust. And suddenly, for the first time since returning, Gislin didn't know what to say next.